Hello everyone, and welcome to my food history web presentation. This presentation will be on agriculture, industry, and the end of famine. Now, please move on to the introduction slide. So, by the beginning of the 20th century, famine as a problem had essentially ended in Western Europe and the developed world as we know it, with the exception of extreme situations like the World Wars. However, famine, deficits of food, continue to be a problem in many places in the world, especially in Africa. Just this year, a famine that puts nearly 20 million people at risk of starvation has been declared in South Sudan, Nigeria, Somalia, and Yemen. Now this is a travesty when you consider that there are places in the world that literally do not suffer from famine anymore. We have eliminated this problem in most of the world, and yet it continues in Africa. So, this presentation will be split into two parts. The first half will cover the history of how food shortages and famine essentially ended as problems in the Western developed world. The second half of the presentation will go on to cover the ways in which the Western developed world, first as colonizers and then as international trading partners, have continued to contribute to the existence of famine and food scarcity in Africa. So, beginning with the end of food shortages, the end of famine in the Western world. This was largely the result of a number of things referred to as agricultural revolutions. Now, the first agricultural revolution largely began in Great Britain, and it was something that essentially it began before the Industrial Revolution. It created the conditions necessary for it. According to Smedjog, it was spearheading and running parallel with the advances. The things that contributed to it included changes in crop rotation, where they stopped leaving portions of land fallow and simply started producing foods in them that would regenerate the soil, the nutrients that had been taken out previously. They also discovered new plants through the Columbian Exchange. New implements and techniques were discovered, and they were applied and had a massive impact on agriculture in Britain. Now, the next agricultural revolution came from what is described as the considerable expansion of the world's land area available for agriculture. There are a number of contributions here. Largely, there's the fact that large amounts of land were opening up in the United States during this period. However, more importantly was what was the second industrial revolution, which is also known as the transport revolution. This is important because not only could they produce large quantities of food now, but they could travel with it. They could take it all over the world. Initially, it was just things like grains that could be shipped on a train without worries about significant loss to the elements or to pests. But as they developed refrigeration technology, animal products became part of this international food trade as well. This was a new thing. Then there's what's referred to as the third agricultural revolution, which is a little more spread out, but it specifically refers to the applications of modern chemistry and fossil fuels to our agriculture. In particular, industrial fertilizer. This makes a huge difference. According to Smedjog, it's estimated that the world could only feed about 3 billion people without industrial fertilizer, which means we're about 4 billion over the mark to survive without it. Another significant contribution was that fossil fuel products began to replace many traditional agricultural products. Of particular importance were draft animals that previously needed land set aside to grow their feed. Now they were replaced by tractors, and they could simply farm more land for food instead. Similarly, artificial fibers, artificial oils produced from fossil fuels, all of these replaced things that were traditionally grown from agricultural products. And the land that had previously been used to grow these industrial products could now be used to grow food instead, which, when combined with the increases of industrial fertilizer, creates a massive improvement in food available. Now, somewhat separate from these three agricultural revolutions, but still important to the solving of hunger in the world, is what's referred to as the Green Revolution, which was defined as a state-driven, market-mediated, and small farmer-based strategy to increase national self-sufficiency in food grains in a string of Asian countries from the mid-1960s. The Green Revolution could be a topic for a presentation all in itself, which is why I'm only going to do a brief discussion of it. But it is what allowed countries like India and China to become at least largely self-sufficient in food production until recent years, and allowed them to compete in the international trade of things like rice. However, there are criticisms of it. It has reduced genetic diversity. It has led to tainted groundwater supplies through the excessive use of pesticides and industrial fertilizers. As I said, it is a whole topic in itself, but it's important to note because of the fact that this is why, at least while famine continues to be a problem in some places in Asia, it does not continue to be the problem all over the continent the way that it seems to be in Africa. Which then leads us on to the first agricultural crisis. We've covered the revolutions that have created this surplus, but with these surpluses came problems. And what we're now going to cover is how those problems were addressed. So during the second half of the 19th century, most European countries had approximately half of their populations working in agriculture. Great Britain was an exception to this. As the first industrializing country, as a relatively small landmass, they only had about 22% of their population working in agriculture. But so what happened is that during the second half of the 19th century, as the first and second agricultural revolution had massively increased the amount of food available on the market, simultaneously, free trade was becoming more popular during this period. And so what ended up happening is that cheap grain imports suddenly became available everywhere in Europe, which meant that the vast majority of European farmers were suddenly being outpriced by the international market. And what is described as a result of this is a particularly difficult situation for agriculture and society. Wages decreased. People suffered. Anyways, so the response to this is what's important, really, is that with a few important exceptions, all European countries, in response to the challenges of the first agricultural crisis, they employed protections for their farmers. Germany, the Alliance of Iron and Rye is what they called it, where they put in protections against cheap grain so that they could build up their own farming. Britain was one of the exceptions in that Britain was the original advocate of free trade. Similarly, the United States was also one of the top exporters at this point, and so they were not interested. Denmark and the Netherlands present the only case of someone who wasn't already at the top of the free trade situation who managed to make some good out of it. They took the cheap grain on the market and invested it as feed into developing their own livestock industry that they then capitalized on. But they were the exceptions rather than the rule. Only those 3 or 4 countries actually did not adopt significant protectionist and subsidies in response to the sudden surpluses of food that resulted from the agricultural revolutions. That then takes us on to the second agricultural crisis, which is essentially the Great Depression. So, following the shortages of the First World War, as I mentioned, shortages did continue to occur during wartime periods. There were shortages, and so prices went down. But the increasing yields that then followed very quickly led to the prices once again diving, and farmers not being able to make a living off of their produce. So once again, protectionist policies and subsidies were the answer. Even Denmark and the Netherlands began to employ these, and even the United States developed an increasingly government-regulated agriculture in response, as many people know, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So, we've covered how overproduction was a problem regularly since the agricultural revolutions, and it continued to be a problem, even after the Second World War. In the 1980s, there were once more problems with overproduction that created profitability issues in agriculture for farmers. So even the United States was once again enforced to increase subsidies in order to make agriculture actually profitable for the farmers. There's an estimate that American farmers actually get way more than the world market price. I think it was 3%, if I'm remembering the statistic correctly. The EU also suffered from similar problems. Having dealt with shortages in many products, focusing on production without thinking ahead, they eventually ended up with overproduction. And their response was also to subsidize exports, to make it more profitable for farmers who could not survive on the prices available in the international market at that point due to the surpluses that have been created by these agricultural revolutions. So the point I've essentially been going with here is that the Western response consistently throughout history has been to employ protectionist trade policies, subsidies for agriculture whenever it was necessary to protect against the sudden price drops that massive increases in production created. This then leads us on to Africa. We've covered the developed world. We've covered how they have created this massive surplus of food that has changed history as we know it. But if we have this massive surplus of food, why is there still famine in Africa? So, let's take a quick look at the situation in Africa. Even currently, this is the situation. Africa became a net importer of food in 1973, and during the 2000 to 2004 period, there were only 9 countries in Africa out of 54 that were net exporters of food. Now, it's important to note the difference between exporting food here versus exporting agricultural products. There is an important difference, and we will go into that later. But agriculture makes up a significant part of the GDP and employment in Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, employment is considered to account for 2/3, and somewhere between 1/3 and 1/4 of the GDP. So very important in Africa. And I would like to point out that this actually parallels the situation in Europe prior to the first agricultural crisis. A large portion of the population is invested in agriculture. This is how they make their living. So, now we move on to the colonial period. It is noted that the colonial period is relatively brief in Africa, but still fairly intensive. Only limited investments were made by European colonizers in the agriculture in Africa, in their African colonies. And for the most part, those investments focused on industrial products or stimulants or basically high-priced export products, not local food production. Cloves in Pemba or palm oil from the Gold Coast are perfect examples. Another thing that was relatively undeveloped in Africa was infrastructure. Railroads were basically built to connect central locations in the continent to the coast. There was no creating of connections within the continent. It was essentially about going from the center out to the water where things could then be taken off the continent. There was very little development of infrastructure as a whole. This compares sharply with places like India, where railways were comprehensively developed. On the subject of colonization, colonization had mostly ended in Africa by the 1970s, and the last colonies were independent by the 1980s, if I remember correctly. So, now we go on to the 80s, and this is what I consider the most important subject of the 80s, for Africans at least, many African countries. Dropping prices for many African commodities during the 1980s, particularly agricultural exports, as we've talked about, prices were dropping. Not only that, but also for raw materials like ores or fuels. They were going down during this period. Many of the developing African countries who had only just gotten out of colonialism and all of the horrors that entails, they ended up in considerable debt trying to build themselves up as independent countries. And so in many of the cases, in response to the debts, the IMF and the World Bank employed something known as structural adjustment programs. According to Smedshog, these were used to quote-unquote set the framework for their policy. Essentially, they were loans that were very conditional, is that they would continue providing them with credit, but only if they followed the economic guidelines of these international institutions. Now, common features of the structural adjustment programs were tariff reductions, as well as reductions in subsidies, deregulation, removal of government, letting the market sort itself out, opening yourself to international trade. This was supposed to help. However, the truth is that what the primary intent of the structural adjustment programs was largely to deal with the credit situation. It was not necessarily about making the country's situation better, it was about making them capable of paying back their debts. Another significant feature was austerity, reducing public spending, which is somewhat covered by the discussion of subsidies. Now, let us look at the consequences of the structural adjustment programs. So, In many African countries where structural adjustment programs were put into place, imports increased significantly of both agricultural commodities, particularly cheap food, and industrial commodities. Now, what the result was is that from the 1980s, when the structural adjustment programs were essentially popular, and until the 2000s, the income per person in Africa stagnated, whereas it was increasing by up to 50% everywhere else in the world. So the structural adjustment programs had gotten rid of tariffs, but in many cases these tariffs were helping to fund what little support there already existed for the local African farmers. There may have been problems with the systems that existed before, definitely. Particular issues can be pointed out in many cases. There were problems with the implementation of Ujamaa in Tanzania, for example, within the case of the political parties and Julius Nyerere. However, that does not take away from the fact that the damage that these structural adjustment policies did was cataclysmic. All of the support structures that had previously existed were removed. And the result has been that farmers who produce things for the international market that are not simply being produced elsewhere, particularly things like coffee, their incomes have increased. However, producers for food markets in the national level have decreased. Now, what is particularly egregious, in my opinion, about the case of the structural adjustment programs is that there's a sharp contrast between the approach taken by the Western developed countries at this time and the policies that were being pushed onto African nations by the institutions that were representative of their economic worldview. In Europe and America, subsidies in order to make export profitable were necessary. And yet, the structural adjustment programs stripped subsidies. These were countries that could not simply afford to subsidize these things on their own, and the structural adjustment programs insisted on them removing them regardless. Moreover, these policies did not fit with what they were doing at the time, and if you look at the history of industrialization and development in Europe, in America, this was never the way that it happened. They always employed protective policies when their own industries or agriculture were not competitive with the world market. They did not force them to compete with the world market. That did not make them stronger. They grew stronger by protecting themselves, by taking time to develop until they were more on par with the productive levels of the international market. So, arguments for promoting African agriculture, specifically food supply. According to Smedshog, agriculture is less suitable as a source of sustainable growth and prosperity than industry, which seems strange for me to point out when I am making a presentation that is strongly arguing for the expansion of agriculture. However, what I would like to point out is what I'm arguing against essentially is the concept of export agriculture as a way of fixing African economies. That they need to continue exporting coffee or palm oil, they just need to produce more cloves. No. That sort of production will not solve their problems, in the argument that I'm putting forward in this presentation. The reason to develop agriculture is that this actually assists the development of industry. So, 4 specific points to make for why developing a national food supply, a national food agriculture, can promote the development of industry, which will provide the source of sustainable growth for prosperity that will help Africans deal with their debt crisis, deal with their financial difficulties that the international situation has created for them, in my opinion. The first point is that you need an agriculture that is efficient enough to feed both your rural and your urban population. It might be argued, why don't you simply buy cheap food off of the international market? My simple response to that is, if that would work, there would not still be famines in Africa. I'm sorry. Increased purchasing power for those farmers who are producing food then creates consumers that can buy things from the developing national industry that might not be ready to compete in the international market yet, that might still be trying to develop, to get investment, to get off the ground, but it creates a market for them that they can sell to. The farmers feed the developing industry, which then provides them with consumer goods. Then, the increasing efficiency in agriculture, which is aided by industrialization, by the gaining of tractors, industrial fertilizer, mass-produced tools, etc. All of these things make agriculture more efficient, which means that more labor gets released from agriculture and can be put into further industrialization, expanding your industrial capacity. And then finally, as your agriculture continues to become more profitable, continues to develop, and has reached the point of being stable and self-sustaining, it can eventually serve as a source of capital for other investments. So, finally we get to the conclusions that I hope to have made a reasonable case for in this presentation. First, historically, European and settler quote-unquote development occurred with both regulation and subsidization of trade and protection for agriculture, along with considerable investments in infrastructure. So the point here is that the European colonizers did not invest in infrastructure, and the structural adjustment programs cut funding that could have been used to invest in infrastructure before they had the chance to develop it. They weren't even given a chance to get off their feet before structural adjustment programs came in and started cutting their feet out from under them. Next, which leads to the next claim, that structural adjustment programs imposed upon Africa by the World Bank and the IMF have by pushing free trade and less subsidization, they've impeded industrialization as well as agricultural development. They've impeded both of these things. And they've actually continued the pattern that was developed in the colonial period, where Africa was treated as a source of raw materials for the industrial machines of the developed world, and then to serve as a market for the products. The main shift is that rather than producing that produced food in the form of cheap exports, have actually been added to the list of things that get exported from the developed world to Africa. And then finally, the final point, and the most positive point in my argument, is I think that supporting agricultural development in Africa through financial aid and reasonable credit, as well as a tolerance for protectionist trade policies for food products, has the potential to not only promote the development of industry and prosperity, but also to contribute to the end of famine in Africa. So, unpack that a little bit. In particular, by protectionist trade policies, what I think is that Europe, America, they have to be willing to accept unequal deals. They have created a horribly imbalanced situation, and they have for over 100 years. If they want Africa to have a fair chance to expand its industry, to build up its agriculture, they have to be willing to give them favorable deals that will allow them protections for their developing markets, for their developing agriculture, for their developing industry, that will favor them until they actually build up to the point where they are competitive with the markets and the industries of the developed world. And what I would argue is that I might be wrong about the fact that agriculture can contribute to industrialization. But I would argue that even if that is not the best path to promoting the increase of wealth, of prosperity, I do think there is a case to be made for the fact that it would prevent the abysmal existence of famine. That a local food supply that could be relied upon, that is not dependent on international market prices, could guarantee food for people who are otherwise, to this day, at risk of starvation in a time where the food wasted in developed countries is measured in football fields. Thank you very much. That is the end of this presentation. There are 2 discussion questions that I would like everyone to provide a response to at least one of them, though you are welcome to respond to both. The first question is, one of the central arguments in this presentation is that there is a disconnect between the policies and strategies used during industrialization in the quote-unquote developed world and those pushed on Africa by colonizers and structural adjustment programs. But given the different historical contexts, do you think that the model of improving national food production as a means of enabling quote-unquote development is appropriate for Africa? So my question here is essentially that I have quoted the history of Europe and America from the 19th century, at a time when the sort of markets that we have now just did not exist. It was an entirely different context. There is a fair case to be made that you cannot simply take a historical example and put it in a different historical context and expect it to work the same way. There are differences that are worth discussing. So what I would like to hear is a discussion of whether or not such an old model of development, of industrializing, actually is relevant today. Now the second question, whereas the first focuses on the historical content, the historical arguments, the second is more historiographical. It focuses more on the author. This presentation is almost entirely based on the work of a scholar named Christian Anton Smedshog. Now, Smedshog is the author of the book Feeding the World in the 21st Century, and it was the basis of this presentation. He has an academic background in ecology as well as economics, and has previously worked in agricultural policy with the European Union and the World Trade Organization. So my question is, do you think that there are strengths or weaknesses in Smedshog's analysis of Africa connected with his personal and professional background? Now, I have phrased this as an open question, that you might think there are advantages, you might think there are disadvantages. I think there may be some strength that Smedshog's background provides. And what I like his book for is the fact that it provides the content. It is a great place where a whole lot of information has been amassed. And while I agree with him on certain points about general trends, general patterns, I will say, to preface this discussion, that I find many of his attitudes about Africa to be reductive, viciously so at times. There are times where he talks about African agriculture as Stone Age, which is disgusting, honestly, for reasons that you can discuss among yourselves with that question. Alright, this has essentially been my presentation. There will be some written instructions accompanying various things to explain what you're supposed to do and the time span you have to do it. Before I finish this video, I would just like to offer a brief apology. I expected this to be put together a little bit better. I was hoping that you would be able to see the PowerPoint behind me somewhat. But I had technical difficulties with the higher quality camera that I acquired to try and make this all happen, and I was forced to fall back on my laptop webcam, which is not nearly as good of quality. Once again, my apologies. I hope this has been an enjoyable presentation, and it has been worth putting up with all the fumbling and technical fudging. Take care, and I will see you all next week.